A millionaire pays a homeless woman to have a baby for him, but when the child was born, you won't believe what happened next. Hello, family. Welcome to Storytime virtually. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, like, and share this video to your friends and loved ones. Don't forget to turn on post notifications for more videos. Sit back, relax as we dive into the story. Daniel Fisher had it all. At the age of 45, he was the CEO of a leading tech company. His name was known across the business world, and his wealth was enough to make most people's heads spin. He had a mansion in the city, a luxurious office, and even a few expensive cars. If there was anything anyone could want, Daniel had it. But Daniel was not happy. Despite all the money, all the power, he couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that hung over him every day. He lived in a world of polished glass and shining steel, where everything looked perfect on the outside. But inside, he felt like something was missing. Love, connection, family. His 2 marriages had ended in failure. His first wife, Emily, had left him after 5 years, saying he was too distant, too focused on his career. His second marriage, to Laura, had lasted only 2 years before it fell apart. Laura had wanted more from him, more of his time, more of his heart. Daniel couldn't give it to her. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was just that he couldn't understand why people wanted these emotional connections. Emotions were messy, unpredictable. They tied you down, made you weak. And so his relationships ended, just as he had expected. Alone. Cold. He never truly allowed himself to grieve the loss of either marriage. Instead, he threw himself deeper into his work. There, he was in control. There, everything was just as it should be. But no matter how many meetings he attended or how many millions he earned, something always nagged at him. He needed a legacy. Something to leave behind when he was gone. A child. Someone who would carry on his name and his fortune. But there was one problem. He didn't want a family. He didn't want to go through another messy, emotional relationship. What if his next wife left him too? What if the child turned out to be a disappointment, like so many things in his life? He thought about it for days. A son. That's all he wanted. But how could he have a child without all the complications of a family? He could hire a surrogate, but that would involve emotional ties he wasn't willing to make. Then it hit him. There had to be another way, a way to get what he wanted without all the emotional baggage. He could find someone who needed money. Someone with no family, no emotional ties. A woman who would be willing to have his child in exchange for financial security. It was a simple arrangement. He would pay her well, and in return, she would give him a child. It didn't need to be anything more than that. No strings attached. For the next few days, Daniel researched the idea. He thought about all the possibilities, all the women he could approach. But he needed someone who was truly desperate. Someone who had nothing left to lose. On a chilly Tuesday afternoon, Daniel was walking through the city park near his office when he saw her. She was sitting on a bench, painting quietly, her fingers stained with the colors of her work. She was different from the other people in the park, more worn, more fragile. Her clothes were old, her shoes falling apart. But there was a beauty in her, an artistry that caught Daniel's attention. He walked over and stood in front of her. She looked up from her painting, her face tired but kind. "You're good," Daniel said, his voice smooth. "I don't know much about art, but I can tell you have talent." Susan looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Thanks," she said quietly. She wasn't sure if he was genuine or just another rich man looking to pass the time by talking to someone like her. "I could help you," Daniel continued, sitting down on the bench beside her. "I'm looking for someone to carry my child. I'll pay you well for it. A large sum of money. You won't have to worry about anything for the rest of your life." Susan raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about? Carry your child? I don't want the complications of a relationship, but I want a child. I need someone who's willing to do this for me, and in return, I'll give you everything you need, money, security, a place to live. I don't want anything more than the child." Susan blinked, not sure if she had heard him correctly. She looked at him more closely now. This man, rich, well-dressed, was offering her what she had always dreamed of: stability. She had been on the streets for years, struggling to survive. Her art, once a source of pride, had been ignored by most, and now it was just a way to pass time. But this man, Daniel, was offering her a way out. A way to escape the nightmare she had been living in. No more sleeping on benches or scrounging for food. A home, money, security. All she had to do was agree to carry his child. "Why me?" she asked, still unsure if this was some kind of joke. "You've been through hard times," Daniel said. "I can see that. You're strong. You have nothing to lose. I'm offering you a chance to change your life, and in return, I get what I need." No emotional ties, just a simple agreement. Susan didn't know what to think. The idea was insane. It sounded like something out of a movie, not real life. But the more she thought about it, the more the offer seemed tempting. She was tired of struggling, tired of living in fear. Maybe this was her chance to finally have a real future. "What's the catch?" she asked. "There is no catch," Daniel replied. "You'll have the child. I'll give you everything you need. Once the child is born, I'll make sure you're set for life." No questions asked. Susan hesitated. She had lived through enough pain and disappointment to know that promises from strangers often meant nothing. But something in Daniel's eyes told her he was serious. And she was tired of being alone, of being invisible. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. Daniel smiled, a businesslike smile, and stood up.
"Take your time.
"I'll be here when you're ready." Susan walked back to her small, run-down apartment that night, her mind buzzing with questions. The man, Daniel Fisher, had left her with a proposition that was impossible to ignore. She hadn't been offered a chance like this in years. A life of comfort, a future without worrying about where her next meal would come from. She had been living on the edge for too long, and now someone was offering her an escape. But the question remained. Was it too good to be true? She sat on the edge of her bed, her worn shoes still on her feet, and stared out the cracked window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. The sounds of the busy street outside drifted in, but in her small, quiet room, it was as if she were worlds away from the rest of the world. Her hands shook slightly as she thought of Daniel's offer. She had been homeless for so long, surviving by selling her art to tourists when she could, but there were never enough buyers. Sometimes she had to beg just to eat. She hated that feeling, the sense that she was invisible to the world, that no one cared about her. She was just another face in the crowd. And now, here was a man who had money, who had power, offering her a way out of all of that. A way to change her life forever. But at what cost? She thought of the life she could give her child if she agreed to Daniel's terms. A safe home.
Food. Clothes.
A future. She could even paint again, something she hadn't done in years because she had always been too worried about survival. The child would have everything she never did. She could be the mother she always wanted to be, without the constant fear of not having enough. But the price wasn't just about money. The price was a piece of her soul. Was she willing to give up the chance for love, for a real connection, just for the sake of comfort? The hours passed, and Susan could hardly sleep. Her mind kept racing, running through all the possibilities. She needed to make a decision. But how? The next day, she woke early and went to the park where Daniel had found her the day before. The weather was cold, but she wrapped herself in her old, threadbare coat and walked through the empty streets. She was searching for clarity, but it wasn't easy to find. When she arrived at the park, she saw Daniel sitting on a bench near the fountain, reading something on his phone. His suit looked expensive, his shoes polished to perfection. He was out of place in this park, surrounded by nature and people who had little. But he didn't seem to care. He was waiting for her, just like he said he would. She took a deep breath and walked over to him. Her heart was pounding in her chest, unsure of what she was going to say. When Daniel looked up and saw her, he smiled, a small, confident smile. "I'm glad you came," he said, standing up to greet her. "Have you thought about it?" Susan nodded slowly.
"Yes.
"I've thought a lot about it. And I have questions. I need to understand exactly what this will mean." Daniel sat back down on the bench and motioned for her to join him. "Of course. I'm not trying to rush you into anything. This is a big decision. But I want to be clear about my intentions. This is not about emotional connections. It's a business arrangement. You'll carry the child, and in return, I'll make sure you're financially secure for the rest of your life. After the birth, you'll have the option to either stay in contact with the child or not. It's up to you. Susan took a deep breath, still unsure of what to say. And what do you expect from me? What do you really want from this? Daniel's expression softened slightly. I want a legacy, a child to carry my name. But I don't want to go through the emotional mess of a relationship. I've already been through 2 marriages that didn't work. I don't want that. I just need a child who will have a future, without all the complications. Susan looked at him for a long moment, trying to read his face. He wasn't asking for anything more than a business transaction, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of loneliness, maybe. It was hard to explain, but she saw it. He didn't seem like the kind of man who wanted love or connection, not in the way she had imagined it. But it didn't matter. He was offering her everything she had dreamed of. She thought about the life she could have. A warm home, a child to care for, a future that didn't involve begging for change or sleeping in alleyways. It seemed like a dream come true. But was it worth the cost? I'll do it, Susan said, her voice steady. I'll carry your child. Daniel's eyes lit up with approval. I'm glad you've decided. I'll arrange everything. You won't have to worry about anything from here on out. Susan nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief, mixed with fear. She wasn't sure what her future held, but she knew one thing for certain. This was a new chapter. A chapter that could change everything. Over the next few weeks, Daniel kept his word. He arranged for her to have medical checkups, paid for a comfortable apartment for her to live in, and made sure she had everything she needed. Susan didn't question it. She moved into the new apartment, which felt like a mansion compared to the tiny room she had left behind. She was surrounded by luxury, but it felt strange. The walls of the apartment seemed too big, the furniture too perfect, as if it were all a dream. And all the while, she grew more and more aware of the life growing inside her. The child that would change everything. She couldn't help but think of the child often, even though she tried not to get too attached. After all, she wasn't supposed to be emotionally involved. This was just a business arrangement. That's what she kept telling herself. But something was happening inside her. As the weeks passed, she began to care for the child in a way she hadn't expected. She talked to it sometimes, placing her hands on her growing belly, whispering soft words. It was a strange, new feeling. She had never felt this kind of connection before. One evening, as she sat in her apartment, looking out at the city skyline, she realized something. She wasn't just carrying a child. She was carrying hope. Her hope. The hope for a better life. For both herself and the child she would bring into the world. And despite everything, despite the way she had started this journey, she couldn't help but feel a bond that was more than just physical. She didn't know where this path would lead. She didn't know if Daniel would ever change, or if their arrangement would ever become something more. But as she looked out the window that night, she knew one thing for certain. Nothing in her life had ever felt this real. As the months passed, Susan's pregnancy progressed smoothly. Daniel had been true to his word, arranging everything she needed. Her life had transformed. The apartment was luxurious, the best doctors were always available for checkups, and she no longer had to worry about where her next meal would come from. Yet, despite all the comforts, something inside Susan felt unsettled. Every time she looked at her growing belly in the mirror, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing in ways she hadn't expected. She wasn't just carrying a child, she was becoming attached to it. The movements, the soft kicks, the way her body was slowly changing, it all made her feel something deep within her that she had never felt before. She had always wanted a child, a real family. But now that she was pregnant, a sense of longing grew in her. She wanted to be more than just a surrogate. She wanted to be a mother. She wanted to love and protect this child. But the agreement with Daniel had been clear. This was just business, and once the baby was born, they would part ways. She had to keep her emotions in check. Daniel, on the other hand, was still the same. He remained distant, focused solely on the baby. He would visit occasionally, bringing gifts or checking in on her, but their interactions were formal and brief. He never stayed long. It was clear to Susan that he wasn't looking for anything more than the child. There was no real connection between them, no tenderness, just business. Yet, as the due date approached, something changed in Daniel. One evening, as the sun began to set, he arrived at Susan's apartment. He had a bouquet of flowers in his hands, a rarity for him. She looked at him, confused. "You didn't have to bring flowers," she said softly, her voice unsure. Daniel looked at her, his eyes softening for the first time.
"I wanted to," he replied.
"You've been doing well. I wanted to show my appreciation." Susan took the flowers from him, still surprised by the gesture. She set them down on the table, then looked up at him. There was something different in his expression, something that wasn't just about the child, but about her, too. For the first time, she felt a sense of vulnerability from him. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly, sitting down across from her. "I'm okay," Susan answered. "Just tired, mostly." He nodded, watching her carefully. "I know this isn't easy. I know it was hard for you to agree to this." Susan didn't know how to respond. She had agreed to the deal, but now, as her pregnancy neared its end, she felt conflicted. She had expected to feel relief when the baby was born, to be done with this strange arrangement, but now she wasn't so sure. She didn't want to let go of the life she had with the child inside her, and she didn't want to let go of Daniel, either, at least not in the way she had planned. Over the following weeks, Daniel continued to visit, and their conversations grew longer, more personal. They began to share more about their lives, their hopes, and their fears. Susan learned about Daniel's past, his failed marriages, the loneliness he felt despite his wealth. He told her about his childhood, how his parents had pushed him to achieve success, but never shown him love. He had spent his life building an empire, but it had come at the cost of everything that truly mattered. Susan, in turn, shared her story. She told him about her struggles as an artist, her years living on the streets, and her dream of one day creating something that could change her life. She spoke of her longing for family, something stable, something real. But she had never believed it was possible, not for someone like her. They didn't say it out loud, but there was an unspoken understanding between them now. The walls that had kept them separate began to crumble, and Susan could see Daniel for who he truly was, a man who had everything but still felt empty. And Daniel saw Susan as more than just the woman who was carrying his child. He saw her strength, her vulnerability, and her capacity to love. In a strange way, they had begun to heal each other. The day finally came, the day Susan went into labor. It was early in the morning when her water broke. She called Daniel, who immediately rushed to the hospital. He had been prepared for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the flood of emotions that hit him when he saw Susan in pain. He had never been a part of a birth before, and it was overwhelming. He stayed by her side, holding her hand as she went through the contractions, offering her comfort in the only way he knew how. He was there, physically, but there was still a distance in his heart. He had always kept his emotions locked away, but now, as he saw Susan struggling, he couldn't help but feel something more for her. Susan, too, felt a deep connection to Daniel during that time. The pain of childbirth was intense, but she wasn't alone. She could feel his presence beside her, and for the first time, she felt as though she wasn't just carrying a child for someone else. She was carrying a piece of herself, too. Hours passed, and finally, the baby was born. A small, healthy boy. He cried for the first time, and the sound filled the room with life. Susan looked at him, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the depth of love she felt in that moment. She had never thought she would be able to have a child, and now, here he was in her arms. Daniel stood there, watching them. He didn't know what to feel. He had wanted this child for so long, but now that it was real, he didn't know how to handle the emotions rushing through him. He had always kept everything at a distance, but this child, this little boy, was a part of him. And for the first time, he felt a deep sense of connection, not just to the baby but to Susan as well. Susan looked up at Daniel, her eyes tired but full of emotion. "He's ours," she whispered. "He's really ours." Daniel didn't know how to respond. He nodded, but inside, he was fighting with his feelings. This was what he had wanted: a legacy, a child. But now, seeing Susan and the baby together, he realized that there was so much more to this than he had ever anticipated. As the days passed, Daniel became more involved. He visited the hospital every day, spending time with Susan and the baby. He watched as Susan held the child, fed him, and rocked him to sleep. It was clear that Susan was a natural mother, and Daniel couldn't help but feel a deep admiration for her. The connection between them grew, and even though it wasn't what either of them had expected, it was real. Eventually, Susan had to return to her apartment to care for the baby. Daniel offered to hire a nurse to help, but Susan declined. She wanted to do this on her own, to prove that she could be the mother she had always dreamed of being. Over the next few weeks, their lives settled into a new routine. Daniel continued to provide for them, but Susan took on the role of mother with strength and grace. As for Daniel, he found himself spending more and more time with them. He wasn't just checking on the baby, he was becoming a part of their lives in a way he had never expected. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Susan holding the baby in her arms, Daniel spoke softly. "I never thought I could feel like this," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I didn't expect to get attached."
To you.
To him. Susan looked at him, her heart full. "I didn't expect this either," she replied. "But maybe that's the point. Sometimes, the best things come when we least expect them." Daniel nodded, and for the first time, he smiled. A genuine, heartfelt smile. "I'm glad you're here, Susan," he said. And in that moment, both of them knew that their lives had been changed forever. The child, their son, was not just a legacy anymore. He was the bridge between their worlds, bringing them together in a way that neither of them could have predicted. It wasn't a perfect story, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long while, both Susan and Daniel felt like they had something real. Something that wasn't about money or power, but about connection, love, and the promise of a future that neither of them had ever dreamed possible. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.